Disgração. In post-war Finland, a string of brutal, unsolved murders stretches across a decade. Young women found dead near lakes and forests, a double homicide at a summer campsite, and a horrifying massacre that would haunt the country for generations. Behind every single case, one man's name keeps resurfacing. Always nearby, always somehow cleared. Was he simply the unluckiest man in Finland? Or one of the most calculating serial killers the world never officially caught? Hook 5. Separate murders, spread across a decade and hundreds of miles of Finnish wilderness. And one man's name comes up in every single one of them. Coincidence? Or something far more sinister? By the end of this video, you'll be asking yourself how a man this connected to so much death walked free his entire life. Quick favor before we start. If unsolved mysteries like this one are your thing, smash that subscribe button and drop a like. It genuinely helps this channel keep digging up cases like this one. All right, let's head into the cold. Historia. You're in Finland. It's 1953. The cold is biting, and the country is still recovering from the aftermath of war. In the southern Finnish town of Riverford, a 17-year-old girl named Alice pedals home alone on her bicycle after a warm evening at a church prayer meeting. Without a hint of worry, she's seen for the last time. By the next morning, tragedy is announced. Police, still struggling to believe such an unusual crime could happen in their quiet town, search the area more thoroughly and find a man's sock. That item, they'd later say, belonged to the killer, Alice's killer. 2 years later, in 1955, further north, in the coastal town of Kemholm, another young woman named Ellie is found lifeless. Her body was left close to her own home in what looked like a sudden attack she never had a chance to defend against. Could her killer have been the same man who left a sock behind at the scene of Alice's murder? At the time, it was something nobody dared imagine. 4 years after that, back down south in the town of Havenwood, 2 young women were enjoying their summer holiday at the well-known Fireside Lake campground. Unfortunately, the following day, a killer who had possibly been lurking nearby for some time decided to take both their lives. And once again, brace yourself. The suspect from the 2 prior cases was reportedly in Havenwood during that very same window of time. But it doesn't stop there. The following year, further south still, in the town of Ashbrook, a horrific massacre would leave a permanent scar on Finland's collective memory. The crime took place along the shores of Blackmere Lake, a vast, dark, elegant body of water that drew families from all over the country in search of peace and recreation. A group of 4 young friends was camping overnight before being attacked and losing their lives in horrifying fashion. The killer left the crime scene in absolute chaos. Curiously, that same ever-present, mysterious suspect from the other cases was admitted to a hospital in the neighboring town on the very day of the attack. Finally, we arrive at 1963, 3 years after the Blackmere Lake incident in the city of Elmport, a place we could say sits somewhere between Ashbrook and Riverford. Here we find the killer's last known trace. A woman named Selma was walking home, accompanied by a man. The next day, she'd be found lifeless in her own apartment. That same recurring suspect from this Finnish saga would appear in the story one final time, having been seen talking with the victim just days before the murder. How can there be so many coincidences? Was this suspect simply the unluckiest man in the world, his presence somehow reported in every single case by pure bad fortune? Or was he a refined serial killer, operating above and beyond all suspicion? The connection between these 5 cases stands as one of the most fascinating criminal theories of the 20th century, one we've decided to call Carl, the enigma of the Finnish saga. In this episode, we're going to feel the icy Finnish wind as we walk through the details of each of these tragic and disturbingly, relentlessly puzzling stories. Let's start from the beginning. On the evening of May 17, 1953, as the Sunday night settled in, 17-year-old Alice Turner left a prayer meeting held in the Mero area of Finland. Beside her was her friend, Maya Hillstrom, who left together with Alice on bicycles, heading toward the village where they lived, Riverford. The meeting had taken place a little under an hour from the girls' homes, but Alice was deeply afraid of making the trip back alone at night. So the two stayed together for a while, until they had to part ways at a fork in the road that would take each of them home. Alice would have to face 6 long kilometers alone, a stretch she never completed. The next day, Alice's parents weren't especially worried about her absence, mainly because she often stayed over at Maya's place after church gatherings. But concern set in when the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Riverford called asking about Alice's whereabouts, since she hadn't shown up for that day's activities. With that, her disappearance was officially reported. Over the following days, more than 30 police officers, along with civilian volunteers, joined the search around the area where Alice had last been seen. But at that point, unfortunately, no trace of her was found. Her initial investigation into Alice's disappearance was led by police commissioners Jordan Kessler and Axel Skoglund. They also received support from the Regional Criminal Police Center, which provided additional officers. On May 21st, a massive operation involving 600 local volunteers was launched, but it yielded little in the way of results. As news of Alice's disappearance spread, it was only a matter of time before the first witnesses came forward. The most notable were a farmer, Oscar Forsby, and his son, Wilhelm Forsby, who reported seeing bicycle and tire tracks near the area where Alice had vanished. On top of that, they claimed to have seen broken glass scattered on the ground, hinting at some kind of collision. But when the site was examined, nothing turned up beyond assorted tire tracks and footprints. Another witness, a 66-year-old caretaker named Helen, said that around 10:30 that night, while feeding the cows, she'd heard someone screaming for help. With all these leads, investigators grew increasingly convinced that Alice had likely met a tragic end and been discarded somewhere nearby. The search expanded into the forested and marshy areas around Riverford, but again, without success. A week after the disappearance, new witnesses emerged. The first was a 13-year-old girl who claimed to have seen a cream-colored car with 2 men inside driving down the same road where Alice had last been seen, around 11 p.m. According to her, the vehicle was moving much faster than normal, with its headlights off. Another witness was an older woman from a neighboring village, 18 kilometers from Riverford, who reported seeing the same suspicious vehicle speeding through the area. Since these were small villages where everyone knew each other, it was easy for locals to notice outsiders. Investigators were well aware of this, which is why they trusted these witnesses, leading them to consider the possibility that Alice had been abducted and taken elsewhere. That theory gained further weight when 2 men came forward to police, saying that on the night of the disappearance, they'd been riding their motorcycle through an area about 20 kilometers from Riverford, where they'd seen the same cream-colored car parked on the roadside. Authorities searched extensively for the mysterious cream-colored car, but no trace of it was ever found. The sightings were widely covered by the media and newspapers, yet the vehicle's owner never came forward. That remained the case until July 22nd of that year, when 2 women out collecting scrap found Alice's bicycle submerged in a swamp in the Lalula area, less than a kilometer southeast of where the girl had last been seen. A wave of unease swept over investigators once they realized the tires had been removed so the bicycle would sink faster into the marsh. What's more, the bicycle had been placed in an area that had already been searched during the week of the disappearance. To investigators, this suggested the culprit was trying to dispose of an important piece of evidence by hiding it in a spot police wouldn't think to check again. Clever, but ultimately it didn't work. Police soon noted the bicycle was in good condition, meaning Alice hadn't been struck by a vehicle, as some had initially believed. Along with this new discovery came more witnesses. A farmer who claimed to have seen a cream-colored car with 2 men inside, and a woman who said she'd heard an argument near the marsh. Armed with this new information, the police chief of a neighboring district led a search along the border between 2 marsh areas around a nearby lake. The lake itself was also dragged in hopes of finding Alice's body, but that search came up empty. The search continued for nearly a month, until a resident of Riverford found Alice's right shoe with one of her socks still inside. Another interesting detail: a few weeks earlier, young tree saplings had been planted at the exact spot where the shoe was found. Once again, police concluded the killer was slowly getting rid of evidence and doing it in areas that had already been searched. The uncertainty over Alice Turner's fate lasted until October 1953, when police discovered a bundle within the search area. Inside, investigators found a woman's left shoe and a scarf, along with a man's sock. All the items were identified as belonging to Alice, except for the sock. The scarf showed marks that looked like bite marks, suggesting Alice may have been gagged. With her own belongings, the day after this discovery, a volunteer taking part in the search found a large dry pine branch standing upright at the center of a shallow pit, a little over 20 centimeters deep, in the marshy area near Riverford. The odd find was reported to authorities. A large group of men gathered around the branch to lift it out, and as they did, a strong odor of decomposition became immediately apparent. The ground was dug up, and beneath the branches, they found the body of Alice Turner. The girl's coat was wrapped around her head and shoulders. The lower half of her body was exposed, with one breast uncovered. Due to the advanced state of decomposition, her fingers had detached, and specialists couldn't determine whether she'd fought back against her attacker. That same day, coroner Anton Ketunen stated that Alice had been struck with a heavy object to the head after death. Her face, nose, and facial bones were shattered, suggesting the weapon could very well have been a rock. There were no clear signs of sexual assault, though the possibility couldn't be ruled out, given how the level of decomposition made such evidence difficult to detect. Police theorized that Alice had likely been buried after the search efforts in that area had already wrapped up. That was because the area had been used for planting trees, and none of the farmers working there had noticed the hole beforehand. The branch placed inside the grave had a sharpened point and appeared to have been deliberately driven into the decomposed body's stomach. Alice Turner's burial took place in late October 1953. More than 25,000 people attended the funeral, including Finland's president at the time, visibly moved by the crime. After the funeral, more than 1,000 people were questioned. Still, investigators never found a genuine suspect with any real connection to the murder. Eventually, the case was shelved and largely forgotten, while Alice's unsolved murder gathered dust in the Riverford Police Archives. Further south in Lapland, in the coastal town of Kemholm, another homicide caught the nation's attention. On the night of December 7th, 1955, 3 girls, Molly, Annalisa, and Ellie Simmons, were walking through the town center, browsing shop windows. It was around 9 p.m. when Molly suggested they all head home, since it was getting bitterly cold. Molly and Ellie set off together in one direction, while Annalisa went the other way. At some point, Molly and Ellie split up too, and Ellie continued on alone toward her house. That would be the last time she was seen alive. The next morning, a student walking the same route Ellie had taken the night before noticed a body lying face down beside the road. When the body was identified as Ellie Simmons, investigators were stunned to realize the crime scene sat less than 40 meters from her own home. The initial findings were brutal. The killer had struck the right side of Ellie's neck multiple times with a knife. Snow covering the body suggested the killer had tried to conceal it after the attack. The path was heavily used by locals, but due to Lapland's long stretches of winter darkness, no one had spotted Ellie's body where it lay. The autopsy revealed no signs of sexual assault, making the motive for the crime seem random. Given this, investigators began digging into the young woman's background. All they found was that Ellie was like any other girl from her village. She enjoyed parties and dancing. Investigators discovered that the day before the murder, she'd traveled to the nearby village of Lawson Hollow, where a small, early holiday gathering had taken place at the Karelian Society House, for which Ellie had managed to get a few tickets. That night, she danced with several men, though none of them appeared to be suspects. At the crime scene, police found the boot prints of what appeared to be a large man, along with bicycle tire tracks. Beside the body, they also found a hunting knife. This particular brand of knife was common throughout northern Finland, often used for camping. The knife showed no clear traces of having been used in the crime, but its presence at the scene still struck investigators as odd. More than 60 people were questioned on the first day alone, including Molly and Anna-Lisa. Molly said she'd gone straight home and listened to the radio. Police confirmed her story by checking with the radio station, verifying that the programs she claimed to have heard did in fact air at the exact time she said she'd arrived home. Either way, she was quickly cleared as a suspect. Eventually, investigators began theorizing that the killer might be some kind of unstable individual, or perhaps someone hired for revenge. This was partly because Ellie's father had worked as a police officer, and some former inmate might have targeted his daughter as a form of retaliation. But that theory soon proved difficult to sustain, pushing the investigation into territory just as murky as Alice Turner's case in Riverford, which, in the end, resulted in the same outcome. The case was quietly shelved. That remained the case for 4 years, until a fresh wave of horrifying murders would form the first real bridge connecting these two cases. On July 18, 1959, 23-year-old office worker Rachel Palmer and her friend, 21-year-old nursing student Emma Nielsen, planned a summer vacation trip together. They set off from the city of Jansford, each on her own bicycle, wearing handmade hats. Their first stop took them through the Savonia and North Karelia regions. From there, they mailed a postcard to their families, letting them know about the trip and saying they'd stop in the town of Varmouth in North Savonia before heading home on July 30th, 1959. It would later be discovered that on July 26th, the two stayed at a guest house in the town of Polvi. Their plan for the next day was to head to the Fireside Lake campground in Havenwood, about 60 kilometers away, a trip expected to take most of the morning. From there on, the only concrete piece of information is that the girls never made it home by the end of July. Worried, their families reached out to the authorities. Search efforts began quickly, but the only solid lead came from the night they'd spent at the guest house in Polvi. That meant the last confirmed sighting had taken place sometime between July 26th and 27th. Rural roads south of Polvi and stretching west to a town called Picton were all combed through by police, volunteers, and members of Rachel and Emma's families. The Army and Air Force also got involved, with a plane flying over the search zone. Unfortunately, though, no sign or clue ever led investigators to the girls' whereabouts. Police interrogated more than 1,000 people over the course of the investigation and arrested over a dozen suspects. By that point, the lack of useful information pushed police to adopt fairly harsh interrogation tactics, aiming primarily to mentally exhaust suspects until something useful slipped out. Still, none of the suspects revealed anything of substance. Media pressure grew so intense that several journalists were arrested or threatened with arrest. That media frenzy for information led to reporters sneaking around the investigation and tailing officers everywhere they went. That was the state of things until August 10th of that year, when 2 young men in their early 20s, identified as Henry and Kevin, came forward to tell authorities they had actually met the girls. According to their account, on July 27th, the pair had run into the 2 young women at the entrance to the Fireside Lake campground, where they'd also spotted a man on a Sullifer brand moped, following them toward the campground's first entrance. Since the young men knew the area well, they were confident the man on the moped was a total stranger to the region. Even so, they hadn't found him particularly suspicious or threatening at the time. That's because they themselves had taken an interest in the girls and decided to follow along the lake's shore by boat, which surrounds the Fireside Lake campground. Doing that, they eventually found Rachel and Emma camped along the lake shore, tents already set up. Kevin and Henry stopped their boat about 50 meters from shore and walked straight over to the girls. There was an attempt at flirting on their part that went nowhere, and after a few hours, the 2 young men left. That was the last time either girl was seen alive. Now armed with knowledge of the area where they'd last been spotted, police went to the location described by the young men. There they found evidence confirming the girls had indeed passed through. But before the investigation could intensify further, 3 young women came forward to report that they'd been the victims of a surprise attack at a campsite between 2 lakes in the region. According to them, the attacker had tried to force his way into their tent, but one of the women managed to zip it shut in time. As the girls screamed for help, the intruder fled the scene. That incident had occurred 2 days before the disappearance in Havenwood, leading police to suspect it might have been the same perpetrator. Search efforts continued intensely through August, until a young Army recruit taking part in the operation discovered human remains in a shallow grave. The bodies had been covered with their own clothing, and the grave had been camouflaged with large tree branches, along with smaller branches that had clearly been cut with a knife. Rachel Palmer had been killed by a heavy blow to the head, while Emma Nielsen had been brutally stabbed in the chest. The girls' belongings had been stolen and hidden around the area. At the time of discovery, it was noted that Emma's face had been covered with a black coat, with additional clothing piled on top of both bodies. Rachel Palmer was found undressed, but with no signs of sexual assault, leading investigators to conclude she had likely been unclothed during the attack itself, rather than stripped afterward by the killer. Notably, the grave sat 215 meters from the exact spot where Kevin and Henry had shown police they'd met the girls, raising questions about how the bodies had gone unnoticed for so long. It was later discovered that the girls' bicycle bags had been found empty near their tent. Police initially theorized the killer had robbed the girls and then committed murder to eliminate witnesses. However, it was noted that the girls' tent had been cut open with a knife, and the support poles had been taken by the killer. The tent's floor was also never recovered, suggesting it had been taken to dispose of blood evidence. Nearby, an iron shovel was found hidden beneath a pile of moss. It was later proven the shovel had been stolen from a farm almost a kilometer away and had been used to dig the girls' grave. The 2 baskets the girls had carried with them were also recovered in the area. The case took a new turn on September 4th, 1959, when Rachel and Emma's bicycles were found in the deepest part of nearby Kerma Lake, almost 130 meters along from the campground. The air had been let out of the tires so they'd sink completely. Every boat owner anchored at Fireside Lake was investigated and ultimately cleared of any involvement. A watch belonging to Rachel was also recovered and appeared to have been deliberately broken by the killer. Police searched extensively for the camera Rachel had brought along on the trip, but it was never located. At that point, new suspects were arrested and interrogated. 3 brothers, Ray, Larry, and Martin, who lived on the farm the shovel had been stolen from. Among the other men detained was a gravedigger named Fernando, who had gone fishing on Kerma Lake days before the murders. Also arrested was a carpenter named Theodore, along with Kevin and Henry themselves, who became suspects once the yacht bicycles turned up in the lake, suggesting the killer likely had access to a boat. All these suspects remained in custody while blood samples were taken and their clothing examined. Larry provided an alibi of being at Theodore's house on the day of the murders, and the carpenter's own alibi was his mother. Larry's nephew Ray provided an alibi for Kevin and Henry, stating he'd run into them on the road to the Fireside Lake campground after they'd returned from meeting the girls. Martin's alibi was his mother, who claimed her son had been home the whole time. Kevin and Henry made it as clear as possible to police that their advances had been rejected by the girls, and that they'd taken the rejection in stride. Their statements convinced police they weren't likely suspects, and both were released. With the investigation stalling, police eventually found another witness who claimed to have seen the man on the moped, following Rachel and Emma. Investigators shifted their focus toward this unidentified suspect, issuing a public appeal to anyone who'd seen a man between 30 and 40 years old riding a moped on the day of the murders to come forward with more information. The appeal also included details describing the man as wearing a brown leather jacket with dark hair, riding a blue moped. The search for this man lasted several days until an arrest was finally announced. Eric Holmberg, 36 years old, was arrested on November 6, 1959, at his home in the town of Munster, along with a blue moped. According to police, the number of witnesses who claimed to have seen Eric was high enough to make him a strong suspect. A knife was found in his home that matched the marks left on the branches found in Rachel and Emma's grave. When Eric was taken to the crime scene, he showed clear signs of nervousness. Initially, he admitted to having observed the girls accompanied by 2 other young men, indicating he'd been watching Rachel and Emma during the hours they spent with Henry and Kevin. However, Eric claimed he'd then continued on his way toward Varmouth. A pistol was also found on the man, with its safety off, suggesting it might have been used recently. That weapon could also explain how the killer had managed to subdue 2 young women. Eric had an extensive criminal record for suspected theft in the area, and had previously been arrested and convicted for burglary, followed by robbery, as well as an arrest involving assault against a woman. Inside Eric's home, police found women's undergarments and pornographic magazines featuring nurses, along with a moped repair manual. Still, investigators noticed several details that didn't quite fit their expectations of the killer. For one, Eric was a short man, and his build didn't seem strong enough to have handled the bodies the way they'd been found. On top of that, investigators believed the killer had to be intimately familiar with the area, and since Eric lived in western Finland, he knew almost nothing about the region. Despite these inconsistencies, the case moved forward with Eric charged in the double homicide, charges he claimed to accept with peace of mind, saying Rachel and Emma's spirits weren't weighing on his conscience. Given this, the prosecutor's office recognized the evidence was entirely circumstantial, with no forensic evidence, no fingerprints actually tying Eric to the crimes. That remained the case until July 1960, when Rachel and Emma's hats, along with a few other missing items, were found along a road between Havenwood and Varmouth. The discovery led investigators to theorize the hats had been discarded by Eric on his way back to Varmouth after the murders. The defense, however, argued the hats were in remarkably good condition, making it nearly impossible they'd been left outdoors for almost a year. It was suggested the real killer had planted them there sometime in the spring of 1960. Over time, some undergarments were also recovered, pointing unmistakably toward Eric Holmberg's innocence and suggesting the real killer was toying with the police. At the same time, without wanting to backpedal on the case entirely, the justice system began considering Eric as a potential suspect in the unsolved 1953 murder of Alice Turner as well. Investigators believed he could very well have been responsible for that crime too. However, according to his lawyer's records, Eric had been serving time for theft at a prison nearly 300 kilometers away at the time of Alice's disappearance. And while Eric Holmberg dealt with suspicion falling on him from every direction, a new murder case was starting to dominate headlines across Finland. Much like the events at Havenwood, this new case had also occurred along the shores of a lake, and for the first time, it would introduce the central figure of this entire story. On the morning of June 6, 1960, carpenter Edwin Johansson alerted police after discovering a horrific scene on the shores of Blackmere Lake, Ashbrook, on Finland's southern coast. When authorities arrived, they found the bodies of 3 teenagers. A 4th body was also located, but by sheer luck, that teenager was still breathing. Before long, the victims were identified as Molly Eriksson and Anja Makinen, both 15, along with a pair of friends, Sam Bowman and Nicholas Gustafsson, both 18, of whom only Nicholas had survived. Still at the hospital, once the survivor regained consciousness, he was immediately questioned about what had happened, but Nicholas could barely remember anything, aside from a strange, almost supernatural figure with red eyes. As a result, doctors suggested his account of events was clouded by shock from the crime, his brain shielding him from the trauma of what had actually happened. Faced with this, investigators had to piece the puzzle together, largely on their own. Analyzing how the attack unfolded, they realized the teens had been inside their tent when the killer cut through it from the outside. One of the victims, Molly Eriksson, was found outside the tent, likely having been dragged there by the attacker, who left her half-naked from the waist down. Notably, she had been stabbed to death, but showed no signs of sexual assault. In fact, Molly had suffered by far the most stab wounds of any of the victims. Searching for witnesses, investigators found a group of bird watchers who claimed to have seen a blond man leaving the tent area near Blackmere Lake. Following this lead, police began making a string of arrests. The first was a man named Carl Wilhelm Grunstrom, known locally for run-ins with campers along the lakeshore. However, his unstable mental state made him a weak, unreliable suspect. So much so that during questioning, Carl actually confessed to the murders, but his confession didn't sound convincing at all. On top of that, his own wife stated he'd been home with her the night of the crime. After several other suspects were ruled out, investigators finally arrived at a name that would tie together every case in this story. We're talking about Carl Ansel, a man in his 40s at the time. According to the investigation, on the very night the murders took place, Carl had been admitted to a surgical hospital in the capital. The doctor who treated him noticed his fingernails were dirty and that he had bloodstains on his clothing. Hospital staff personally went to the police to voice their concerns about the man, but when he was finally brought in for questioning, he was eventually removed from the suspect list entirely. That's because police had become convinced the real culprit had to be the sole survivor of the tragedy, Nicholas Gustafsson himself. Curiously, Finland's Criminal Investigation Laboratory analyzed the shoes recovered from Nicholas and found blood from all 3 victims on them, except, notably, none of his own. To experts, there was remarkably little of Nicholas's own DNA at the crime scene compared to that of the victims. Who died? Investigators and forensic experts alike came to share the same theory, that Nicholas Gustafsson had killed all 3 out of some kind of fit of rage. This idea gained traction from the fact that his friend and girlfriend, Molly, had suffered far more injuries than the other victims. That theory was further reinforced by a witness camped near the group on the night of June 5th, who claimed to have overheard the 2 young men arguing, and that Nicholas had seemed intoxicated. The city prosecutor believed this version of events, that Nicholas was the likely killer, and considered pursuing a life sentence against him. But Nicholas's attorney, Rita Lindqvist, argued in his defense that her client's own blood had also been found in significant quantities inside the tent. And if there truly had been a fight between Nicholas and Sam, the injury to Nicholas's jaw would have left him in no condition to carry out such violent, murderous acts, especially not against that many victims. The prosecutor's office did everything it could to convict him, until, in 2004, nearly 44 years after the crime, Nicholas was formally charged. On August 4, 2005, he was brought to trial. His defense argued the crime could only have been committed by 1 or more outside attackers, continuing to insist it would have been physically impossible for Nicholas to kill 3 people under those conditions. Eventually, in October 2005, it was announced that Nicholas had been acquitted, with all charges dropped. As a result, the Finnish state ended up paying an enormous settlement, equivalent to nearly $60,000 for the psychological suffering Nicholas endured over those years. But before all of that unfolded, back in May 1961, suspect Eric Holmberg once again made headlines. He had taken his own life shortly before he was set to stand trial for the murders of Emma Nielsen and Rachel Palmer, as well as his suspected involvement in the 1953 death of Alice Turner. Eric had attempted suicide once before. Some say his decision was driven by the looming life sentence he was likely to receive, which in Finland at the time meant forced labor for the rest of his life, rather than any admission of guilt. The prosecutor's office, however, chose to treat his suicide as a defining piece of evidence pointing to his guilt in the brutal crime at the Havenwood campground. With that, of the 4 brutal murder cases that had struck Finland over the previous 6 years, the justice system considered one of them closed. But the attention of the Finnish public would soon turn to another homicide case that would come to define the decade. Everyone in the city of Elmport, Finland, knew Selma Whitfield, 34, the local lottery ticket seller. The woman was known not just for selling luck to local residents, but also for frequently being seen in the company of wealthy men around town. To some, she seemed like a high-class companion. To others, she was simply a woman who lived with freedom and boldness. But by all accounts, Selma had grown somewhat unhappy with her lack of luck in life, particularly due to her financial struggles and her less-than-glamorous job. On the night of July 22nd, 1963, she'd gone out to dinner at a restaurant on Eric Street in Elmport, where she danced and met several men. It was around 1:30 in the morning when she returned to her apartment building on Rauhan Street, accompanied by a man. That would be the last time Selma Whitfield was seen alive. The car catch. Following day, at 4 p.m., Selma's friend Sarah Niemanen went up to her 8th-floor apartment to do the general cleaning they'd arranged. Selma paid Sarah to clean her home regularly. Their trust in each other was genuine. Sarah even had her own copy of the apartment key. Still, something felt off the moment she stepped into the hallway. On the entryway rug, Sarah spotted a piece of mail lying discarded, and upon getting closer, recognized it as Selma's rent receipt. Once inside, Sarah called out for her friend, met only by silence. And unfortunately, that silence gave way to a trail of blood that led Sarah straight to the floor of the main bedroom. There lay Selma Whitfield, nude, with a lamp cord tied around her neck, unmistakably dead. The bedroom was in complete disarray, with drops and smears of blood scattered throughout the room. The sight was horrifying for Sarah, who immediately called the police. The scene was sealed off, and according to forensic investigators, a violent struggle had taken place between Selma and her killer. Fragments of glass were found on the victim's pillow, and a partially broken bottle sat on the windowsill. Beside the bed, a dresser had been knocked over, and on the floor near her body lay the woman's telephone and alarm clock. Selma's injuries were concentrated mainly on her right temple, but another significant wound to her right ear, roughly 7 centimeters long, also caught the coroner's attention. At the scene, investigators noted the victim's clothes were scattered in the middle of the living room, with a small amount of cash lying nearby. Nothing had been stolen, ruling out robbery as a motive. Initially, officers theorized that Selma had likely been entertaining her guest and that, at some point, he'd turned violent. That theory sparked outrage in Elmport, where police clearly seemed intent on painting the victim as a sex worker. In the kitchen, 2 empty glasses were found, having been used to drink wine. Police then dug into Selma's past and discovered that 3 weeks earlier, she'd been assaulted by a German sailor. Friends told police the violence had occurred after Selma refused to let the man into her apartment. However, new information would soon add an even darker layer to the case, namely, that the victim had been seen returning home with a certain man the very night she was killed. Finnish police couldn't help but notice how meticulous this mysterious killer had been in his actions. In the ashtray, inside the apartment, they found more ash than actual cigarette butts, which investigators took as a sign the killer had collected his own. On the edge of the bathtub, there was a small amount of pinkish water, suggesting he'd likely tried to clean himself up. The bedsheet on the victim's bed had a section, roughly 10 by 15 centimeters, cut out, seemingly removed as a way of eliminating evidence. Investigators initially believed the cut had been made to collect semen, but soon began to theorize. The killer might have used the fabric to stop bleeding from some kind of wound, since they suspected the broken bottle had actually been used by Selma herself, not the attacker. Despite the killer's otherwise careful behavior, investigators noted that at some point he seemed to stop caring about covering his tracks, leaving several fingerprints behind, along with a palm print on the windowsill. Bloody marks were also found on the 8th-floor elevator door, and another bloody handprint was located on the stairwell railing of the lower floors. Beside Selma's body, police found a bare, bloody male footprint. Investigators concluded the crime had occurred during a sexual encounter. One of the neighbors from the floor below told police that around 3 a.m., she'd heard noises coming from the apartment above. According to her, the sounds lasted about 10 minutes. Another resident of the building reported seeing a man in the elevator who looked exhausted and appeared to be trying to hide, his hand under his arm, as if he didn't want the woman with him to notice something. He was described as a man between 27 and 30 years old, tall, at least 180 meters, with thicker hair on top and a smoother, cleaner-shaven face. The suspect was wearing a dark suit with a white shirt. Investigators also learned that Selma and the man she'd brought home after Saturday's outing had taken a taxi. They managed to track down the driver, a man named Edward, who described Selma's companion as having a foreign accent and speaking a foreign language. According to Edward, Selma had tried communicating with the man in Swedish, without much success. The driver also mentioned the man seemed to be either German or Dutch. Witnesses at the restaurant echoed this description, adding that the man had seemed like a sailor of some kind, with a somewhat childish demeanor. Many people had spoken with him that night, but the description of the man grew increasingly muddled with each new account. In the end, investigators were left with descriptions of a man between 22 and 25 years old, with light brown hair. His clothing only added to the confusion. Some said he wore a brown suit, while others described a small gray and black checkered jacket paired with dark trousers. This inconsistency led investigators to believe Selma had likely danced with more than one man over the course of the night. To make matters worse, more than 30 ships were docked in Elmport's harbor at the time, meaning plenty of sailors had recently arrived in the city. Of those 30 ships, only 17 were deemed relevant to the investigation. Dozens of sailors and ship captains were questioned, but by the end of August, only 4 had been fully investigated. The physical descriptions and the footprint found at the scene didn't match in most cases. As a result, many potential suspects were released for lack of physical evidence. The search proved complicated. Police had an overwhelming amount of information, but very little that was actually solid. On top of that, the contradictions among witnesses didn't help matters, leading investigators to suspect the man had lied about his occupation. It was at this stage of the investigation that a familiar name once again caught the attention of Finnish police. Carl Ansel, well known in Elmport for his heavy drinking and aggressive behavior. Several witnesses claimed to have seen Carl talking with Selma at local restaurants throughout that week. Investigators felt compelled to bring him in for questioning, especially once they discovered his name had already come up in connection with the mysterious massacre at Blackmere Lake. With that, Carl was brought in for questioning on October 30th, 1963. According to Carl, he'd been passing through the region and was staying at a guest house with his wife, where his Finnish host had arranged for him to work at a cash register factory. According to the host, Carl and his wife, Vera Ansel, had stayed with him and his own wife until July 24th, 1963. Still in the host's words, on the day of the crime, Carl had reportedly been watching television, and the following day was seen wandering around the house as usual. Carl's car had remained parked directly beneath the host's bedroom window, and the man said he almost certainly would have woken up had Carl left during the night to do anything secretive. During his interrogation, Carl insisted he'd only come to the city to help repair a hole in the floor of the university library, and claimed the only woman he'd met during that time was the woman running the guest house where he stayed. Given these solid alibis, Carl was ruled out as a likely suspect, and in the years that followed, Selma's murder case was shelved, just like all the others before it. However, Carl's story carries a much darker undertone when you consider everything that happened across Finland during those years, something that would only come to light much later, raising serious questions about just how innocent Carl Ansel really was. Years after all these cases, Carl was named by independent writers and investigators as the likely mastermind behind this entire string of murders that took place across Finland between 1953 and 1963. That's because, on his deathbed, he laid out every detail of his life to a single man, Martin Palmquist, who had taken it upon himself to research Carl's life at the man's own request. Martin had previously served as a commissioner with Finland's criminal police and had always believed Carl was guilty in Selma's case. Alongside him was Jonas Berg, an important witness who could place Carl in Finland throughout the years these murders occurred. Together, Martin and Jonas uncovered a great deal through interviews with Carl and his wife, Vera. Carl Ansel was born in Germany on December 9, 1923. His father was Adam Ansel, son of Henry Ansel, a businessman involved in the metals trade who lost everything during World War I. Because of this, Carl's family and the generation after grew up in the midst of poverty and hunger. But once Adam grew older, he found opportunities within the commerce controlled by the Nazi regime, starting in 1933. Though he opposed much of what was happening in Germany at the time, he adapted regardless. Eventually, he had a son with a woman, Carl, who grew up very differently from his father, developing genuine admiration for the government the Nazis had built. As a result, by the time he turned 18, Carl was eager to join the ranks of those feared soldiers. In 1941, that wish came true, and Carl found himself enlisted within a Nazi military unit. At some point, he managed to secure a position within the SS organization, which would go on to become globally infamous for its role in the Holocaust, where the lives of nearly 6 million Jewish people were taken. After some time, Carl was sent to work at the Auschwitz concentration camp. For hours and days on end, all Carl heard were constant screams, echoing from every direction of that terrible place. According to Carl himself, in his later interview, he blindly believed at the time that the Führer had given him the authority to punish anyone who stood against that power. Still, after his first year there, Carl noticed his fellow soldiers were almost constantly using drugs like amphetamines and morphine. The whole situation began to feel deeply degrading to him, and he started growing disillusioned with Nazism. He found himself nearly at his breaking point in the face of such horror, until, during one of the executions, Carl ended up vomiting. That obvious sign of weakness didn't go unnoticed, and he was sent to a room where he received a formal warning from his superior. To make matters worse, around that time, he developed a kind of compassion and affection for one of the Jewish prisoners. When the relationship was discovered, he was almost immediately sent to the Eastern Front, which essentially amounted to a death sentence. As luck would have it, though, Carl ended up captured by Soviet forces and sent to a prisoner of war camp. From there, he and his fellow prisoners were forced to march for days between different camps, until, at one of these camps, he received an offer to cooperate with the Soviets. Carl decided to accept, and in 1946, the former Nazi soldier was sent to Moscow, where he underwent new training. Afterward, Carl became responsible for the Finnish department. During this period, his duties included learning Russian, Finnish, a bit of English, and Swedish. In the fall of 1950, Carl was sent to Germany, then on to East Berlin. Once there, his next orders were to travel to Finland, where he would meet a Finnish woman named Vera Miriam Talvio, whom he was meant to marry. The mission was for Carl to work toward becoming a naturalized Finnish citizen, since his assignment in the country would take years to complete. In July 1952, Carl arrived in the city of Helsford, Finland. There he was to locate a cream-colored Opel vehicle, in which a driver identified as Anton was waiting for him. Supposedly, these were the first mysterious steps of Carl Ansel's story. From that point on, he was less than a year away from the events that would shock the small Finnish town of Riverford. During his assignment in Finland, Carl took on odd jobs, working as a handyman and even as a church painter, the kind of work someone with military training could easily pick up and perform competently for local residents. At the same time, though, Carl continued using certain drugs, like amphetamines, which drastically affected his mood. In Finland, Carl and Vera were reunited under orders from their superiors. At first, a kind of romance began to blossom between them, but Vera was afraid of being with Carl, fearing someone might discover the real reason he was in the country. Neither of them had the freedom to meet many other people, though she was aware Carl slipped away on his own from time to time. As time passed, Vera even began to suspect the man's sanity. Deep down, she knew there was something in Carl's past she would never fully understand. On the morning of May 17, 1953, Vera and Carl visited her parents in a town called Kauhala, Finland. The couple was accompanied by their driver, Anton, who, under orders from the organization, was to take them wherever they wished to go. In the afternoon, Carl went out alone with his driver, saying he was in a hurry to finish some painting work. But when they returned, Vera noticed something strange. Carl was missing one of his socks, and his shoes looked oddly soaked with water and mud. The next day, Vera learned that 17-year-old Alice Turner had gone missing. A few nights later, Carl and Anton once again left without saying where they were going, but Vera saw them load an iron shovel into the trunk of the car. She asked why they needed it, and Carl explained that the old paint at the church he was working on was high up, and a shovel would make it easier to scrape off. As they talked, Vera also noticed a dent along the side of the vehicle, as if it had struck something. Over time, though, she ended up putting those strange incidents out of her mind. Then, in August 1953, the two got married, and the woman became known as Vera Ansel. Shortly after, authorities announced they'd found a man's left sock near the area where Alice had gone missing. Vera barely had time to process that news before, the very next day, Alice's body was discovered. It quickly became clear to everyone in town that she had been murdered. On October 25, 1953, Alice Turner's funeral took place, drawing mourners from across the entire nation. Vera would later recall that Carl seemed strangely surprised by just how many people had shown up. The town struggled to move past Alice's death, and Vera found herself struggling with her own growing uncertainty about her husband. 2 years passed before Vera learned of another crime. This time in the town of Kemholm, a girl had been found dead. Ellie Maria Simmons, 20 years old. According to authorities, someone had murdered Ellie shortly after she said goodbye to her friend. Strangely, Vera noticed that during that same week, Carl had traveled frequently to areas near Kemholm. She also couldn't help but notice certain similarities to the 1953 case. She'd later recall that her husband claimed he was traveling to Kemholm to visit an old wartime companion, Ray Järvinen, though she knew, somehow, that this was a lie. At the time, fear and suspicion took hold of the woman's mind, but once again, she chose to push the story and her doubts aside. The following years passed quietly. In 1954, the KGB was consolidating its power amid the growing Cold War, and up until 1958, Carl's movements remain a complete mystery. He resurfaces only in 1959, when he was offered work at a church in South Savonia, Finland. Summers there were known to be beautiful, a trait the region was famous for. While there, Carl became acquainted with the parish in the municipality of Havenwood, where he also expressed interest in working. During his stay in Havenwood, he learned about the well-known Fireside Lake campground, where young people frequently gathered for lovely nights around the campfire. Without a doubt, this new region seemed perfectly suited for Carl and Vera Ansel. But the days that followed would prove to be considerably darker. That's because, in the summer of July 1959, the Fireside Lake campground in Havenwood became the setting for the haunting double disappearance of Emma Nielsen and Rachel Palmer. Vera immediately felt a chill run through her upon hearing about the case. She hadn't seen her husband in days, who was supposedly off painting churches somewhere. As the case unfolded and the bodies were eventually found, Vera realized just how familiar it all felt, but she chose to remain silent. The following year, though, another tragedy would once again haunt the woman's mind. 4 young people had been attacked by an unknown, deadly assailant near Blackmere Lake in Ashbrook. As the investigation got underway, Vera had no idea where her husband even was. She would only learn later that he'd been admitted to a surgical hospital in the capital, where he would go on to become a suspect in the case. According to witnesses, the doctor who treated Carl mentioned that at one point, the man had read a newspaper article discussing how homicides against women had risen since the Second World War, an article Carl apparently found quite interesting. The suspicions were obvious. The recent massacre at Blackmere Lake had shaken the Finnish public deeply, and Carl's personality was, at the very least, suspect. Curiously, writer Jonas Berg who at the time held a bachelor's degree in medicine, also worked at the very hospital where Carl was treated. That was his first encounter with the suspect. His sense of unease would stay with him for years, until he eventually co-authored, alongside Martin Palmquist, the book that lays out the entire theory presented in this story. At the time, though, police were focused on suspecting the boy who'd survived the Black Mirror Lake attack and refused to seriously consider the hospital staff's statements about Carl. They didn't even bother going to the hospital to question the suspect directly. And while Carl was still recovering, staff began noticing an Opel parked outside the building at all hours. Police were called back in, and this time decided to investigate the vehicle, discovering it belonged to a local resident of Ashbrook. That resident turned out to be Anton, Carl's driver, who, curiously, was living just 5 kilometers from Black Mirror Lake at the time. Still, nothing incriminating was ever found connecting him to the crime. When authorities released a description of the suspect as a blond man with long hair, Carl oddly went and cut his hair, even though it hadn't been particularly long to begin with. Doctors and hospital staff decided to send Carl's clothing to police for testing, but nothing was ever found. To many, it seemed as though Carl was somehow being protected, whether by the authorities themselves or by someone with even greater influence. Without much explanation, at some point authorities did bring Carl in as a formal suspect for questioning, only to dismiss him again shortly after, declaring him innocent. According to the book Trust or Death, The Enigma of Carl Ansel, Martin Palmquist writes that following the events at Black Mirror Lake, the Soviets, or more specifically, the KGB, officially cut off all contact with the man, which brings our story to the final crime Carl was allegedly involved in. After being discharged from the hospital, Carl returned home as though nothing had happened, and the years that followed were once again calm for the couple. However, in July 1963, Carl and Vera, by then settled in Sweden, decided to take a vacation back in Finland. The couple had grown tired of each other's company by that point, though Vera still felt a deep fear of ever separating from Carl. Meanwhile, Carl grew visibly agitated any time she brought up the missing sock from 1953, or Alice Turner's death. What Carl didn't know was that Johannesburg happened to be in the same region that same summer. Without realizing it at first, Jonas was wandering the outskirts of Elmport when he came across the very same car that had caught hospital staff's attention back in 1960. The car belonged to Anton, Carl's private driver, something Jonas hadn't known at the time, though he was aware the two men were traveling together. The events at Black Mirror Lake still weighed heavily on his mind, and he openly blamed Carl Ansel for what had happened there. But what truly shook him came just days later, when Jonas came across a news story that gave him an unsettlingly familiar feeling. Selma Whitfield, 34, had been brutally and viciously murdered in her own apartment. According to public reports, the victim had been seen with a man just hours before her death. The investigation eventually pointed toward Carl, after several witnesses reported having seen the victim talking with a German man. And even though the local police were aware of his prior involvement in the Black Mirror Lake investigation, his questioning seemed to move remarkably fast. And as a result, Carl was released once again. Rumors soon began circulating that, upon returning home, Carl had burned his clothes and taken new ones from the host family he was staying with. Vera would later say she decided to help her husband, and recalled finding a receipt in one of his pants pockets from the very establishment where Selma had last been seen alive, a detail that placed Carl at the scene. That receipt was never confirmed as genuine, since Vera claimed to have burned it herself. Years later, the host of the guest house where the couple had stayed would also tell Martin Palmquist that he'd seen Selma visit Carl, but had chosen to stay silent with police at the time. Around that period, after Carl was questioned in connection with Selma's case, his profile was reportedly forwarded to secret police forces. It seems an investigation into Carl Ansel's past was quietly carried out, one that ended up linking him to several other unsolved murders, something Martin Palmquist would only learn much later. Carl was tied to the murders of Bridget Lindstrom, found dead in April 1958 in the town of Västervik, and Agnes Nyholm in Stockholm. Also connected were the murders of Ulla Persson, killed in a suburb of Stockholm, followed by Berit Lindqvist. Both Berit and Ulla, they had been strangled and had personal items stolen, shoes, watches, and other belongings. Still, investigators couldn't get anything out of Carl, nor could they find any physical evidence tying him to those crimes. By 1964, he and Vera moved back to Sweden for good. Shortly after, Carl let Anton go, claiming he no longer needed his services, and thanked him for staying by his side until the end. Curiously, in 1969, Anton was found drowned in a Finnish river. His death ruled a suicide. A few years later, in 1970, Carl and Vera finally divorced. In the years that followed, former police officer and Central Criminal Police Commissioner Martin Palmquist sought the woman out. Around 1990, Martin launched a crime magazine called Alibi, dedicated to exploring unsolved and ongoing criminal cases. One of those cases was this very string of 5 deaths, which Martin believed had all been the work of Carl Ansel. With the help of physician, neurologist, and writer Jonas Berg, the two men investigated every detail of the story, tracing Carl's every move. Then, in 1997, Carl himself reached out and invited Martin Palmquist for an interview, in which he recounted his entire life in strikingly cryptic terms. Curiously, Carl mentioned that for a brief period in 1959, he'd met a man named Lee Harvey Oswald in Helsford, Finland. Yes, that name is familiar. Lee Harvey Oswald, the man behind the assassination of President John Kennedy in 1963. According to Carl's version of events, he was the one who'd helped Lee cross the border, working alongside Finnish and Soviet authorities. It's worth noting that, to this day, there remains genuine mystery around why Lee Harvey Oswald would have traveled to Finland at all. Journalists claim to have found records confirming the man's presence in Helsford, but when they went looking for those same records again later, they had simply vanished. Today, Finnish authorities have openly stated their views on Martin Palmquist and Jonas Berg's investigation. To them, the book, Trust or Death, The Enigma of Carl Ansel, is a purely fictional work, but Jonas and Martin never once wavered in their convictions. To them, the police had failed to deliver justice for the victims, and they had no intention of giving up their search anytime soon. That persistence eventually led them to discover that Selma Whitfield had a son named Henrik. Years later, Henrik himself even began to wonder whether Carl Ansel could have been his father, since Henrik is the Finnish variation of the German name Carl. That connection, however, was never proven. In June 1998, Carl Ansel died of natural causes in the town of Danderyd, Sweden, at 75 years old. He left behind a tangled web of unanswered questions about his actions in this world, making it impossible to say for certain whether he ever told the truth. His ex-wife, Vera, for her part, maintained in interviews that she firmly believed her former husband was responsible for those seemingly random deaths. And yet, no concrete evidence of that connection was ever found. Nothing beyond the cryptic interview Carl himself gave on his deathbed. And so, these 5 criminal cases, spanning from 1953 to 1963, remain unsolved to this day.